The first human ship came through our sky like a wound opening. I was standing in what remained of the civic terrace in Althura, the provincial capital I had administered for 11 years before the Dominion bombardment turned administration into triage and triage into arithmetic. My daughter Selin was asleep against my hip, wrapped in a thermal sheet we'd pulled from a collapsed medical depot. She was 4. She weighed almost nothing. I held her like she was the last object on the planet worth protecting because on some level I couldn't speak aloud. She was. The distress beacon had been my decision. I want that established before anything else. Before the justifications, before the context, before the 12,000 arguments I've rehearsed in the years since. It was my hand on the transmitter, my voice encoding the plea, my authorization codes still valid, impossibly, because nobody had bothered to revoke the credentials of a provincial administrator whose province no longer existed. I aimed the signal at the only coordinate that wasn't Dominion-controlled, a narrow corridor of unaligned space where, according to trade rumor and refugee whisper, a species called humans maintained a listening station. I didn't know what humans were, not really. I knew they were new. I knew the Concord had flagged them as anomalous. I knew a Bravari merchant had once told me over stale Kalahari root that humans built things the way other species fought with too much material and not enough elegance and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was finished. I sent the signal because we were dying, not dramatically, not in a single cataclysm. We were dying the way a lake dies when someone diverts the river feeding it slowly, measurably, and with a receding waterline that makes every morning a smaller version of the one before. The Dominion had broken the orbital grid, collapsed our supply chains, poisoned 3 of our 4 freshwater processing hubs, and then this was the part that hollowed you out. They had simply left, moved on to the next campaign objective. We were not important enough to occupy. We were important enough to break, and not important enough to watch die. 82,000 Valeth civilians in Althura and the surrounding basin, no functioning medical infrastructure, 11 days of nutrient stores, a contaminated aquifer, and our winter, which lasted 9 months and dropped temperatures low enough to fracture exposed stone, was 6 weeks away. So I sent the signal, and 9 days later, the sky split open, and what came through was not a rescue shuttle. It was a carrier group. I counted them as they breached atmosphere in formation. The lead vessel was enormous, a flattened, angular thing that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated curves and loved punishment. Behind it, in staggered columns, came 14 more ships of varying size. Some were clearly military, some were clearly transport. Some were things I had no classification for: wide, flat-bellied craft that moved with a strange, purposeful slowness, like they were already measuring the ground before they'd landed. The sound was annihilating. Our children screamed. Selin woke against my chest, and I felt her entire body go rigid. I held her head against my shoulder so she wouldn't see, because the last time ships had come through our sky in formation, they had killed 40,000 people in 11 minutes. The lead ship landed 2 kilometers from the civic terrace. It did not ask permission. It did not hail us on any frequency. It simply descended, extended massive landing struts that drove into the earth hard enough to shake the ground under my feet, and opened. What came out was not what I expected. What came out was people. Hundreds of them in organized streams, wearing uniforms and carrying equipment I couldn't identify, moving with a speed and coordination that looked rehearsed, like they had done this exact thing, landed on a broken world in a broken city, and begun 100 times before. Some of them were already assembling structures before the dust had settled. Others were running cables. Others were, I didn't understand this, for hours drilling. And at the front of the column, walking directly toward the civic terrace with a translator unit clipped to his collar and a sidearm on his hip, was a human. He was shorter than I expected, broader. His face was weathered and blunt, and he had a quality I would later learn to recognize as the defining characteristic of human military officers. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He stopped 6 meters from me, looked at Selin, looked at me. His translator crackled. "Provincial Administrator Naiva Torath?" I nodded. "Commander James Aldrich, Combined Expeditionary Relief Group 7, United Earth Forward Command." He said it the way someone recites a serial number. Then he looked past me, at the ruins, at the huddled clusters of my people watching from broken doorways, at the smoke still rising from the eastern reservoir where a Dominion munition had cracked the containment wall 8 days ago. "We got your signal," he said. "We brought what we could." I looked at the carrier group behind him, at the military vessels, at the bombers. I could see them now, parked at the perimeter, angular and heavy and unmistakable in purpose. "I asked for shelter," I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, something more complicated. "Ma'am," he said, "this is what shelter looks like where we come from." They moved faster than catastrophe. That was the part that disoriented me first. Not the scale, not the noise, not the weapons, but the speed. Within 4 hours of landing, the humans had erected a water purification system that was already producing clean output from the contaminated aquifer. Within 6 hours, they had a field hospital operational with equipment I'd never seen before, staffed by medics who moved through our wounded with a brisk, systematic focus that looked almost cold until you watched their hands and realized they were gentle. Every single one of them, even when they were fast. Within 12 hours, they had begun demolishing the eastern quarter. I found out when Tanel Sorath, who had served as my infrastructure coordinator before the bombardment and now served as whatever I needed him to be, came running to the command post the humans had erected at a prefabricated structure that smelled like polymer and hot metal, and something faintly organic I later learned was coffee. "They're tearing down the Valith residential blocks on the eastern ridge," Tanel said. His voice was controlled, but his pupils were wide. "The Valith stress response that means the body is preparing to run. 3 square blocks, heavy equipment. They didn't consult anyone." I found Commander Aldrich in the command post, standing before a holographic terrain map of Althera that was more detailed than anything my own government had ever produced. He had people around him, officers, engineers, specialists, all talking, all moving, all doing things simultaneously, in a way that made the room feel like the inside of a working engine. "Commander," I said, "your people are demolishing residential structures in the eastern quarter." He looked up, nodded. "The contamination from the reservoir breach is in the substrate. Those buildings are saturated. Another 2 weeks and the toxin concentration in the walls will become aerosolized. We're removing them before winter seals everything under ice, and your people spend 9 months breathing poison." He said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd explain why you moved a piece on a game board. "Those are homes," I said. "Yes, ma'am." People lived in those buildings. Some of them were born in those buildings. The murals in the central block date back 300 years. We photographed everything before we started. He pulled up an image file on a side screen. Thousands of images, organized, cataloged, tagged with location data. The murals are recorded. The personal effects from units we could access safely are in storage containers 17 through 22 at the main depot. We prioritized items that appeared culturally or personally significant. He'd thought of it. He'd already thought of it and done it and moved on to the next problem. I stood there with the objection still in my mouth and no ground under it. "The replacement structures will be up in 6 days," he continued. "Insulated for your winter tolerances. Capacity for 300% of the original occupancy, because your displaced population from the southern basin needs somewhere to go, and those ridge structures were the most defensible position for—" He stopped, glanced at me. "For residential expansion." He'd been about to say defensible position. That was when I understood something that would take months to fully articulate. The humans were not building a refugee camp. They were building a forward operating base that happened to have civilians inside it. Every structure they erected, every road they cleared, every system they installed, served dual-purpose humanitarian and military. The hospital could be a triage center. The water system had redundant capacity for a garrison. The new residential blocks on the eastern ridge were oriented to provide overlapping fields of fire across the valley approach. They were saving us, and they were fortifying us, and they did not see a difference between the two. That night I sat with Selene in our assigned quarters, a prefab unit that was warmer, cleaner, and more structurally sound than anything I'd lived in for the past 2 months. She was eating a human ration bar that she'd decided she liked despite my concerns about biochemical compatibility. The human medics had run a full panel on Valith human dietary overlap within hours of arrival. 91% compatible. They'd flagged the 9% and color-coded every ration. "Mama," Selene said, "are the loud ones staying?" "I don't know, love. I want them to stay." She chewed thoughtfully. "They're scary, but they fix the water." I looked at her. 4 years old and already performing the calculus that would define my life for the next 2 years. The people helping us terrified me, and the help was real, and I could not hold both truths without something in my chest pulling apart. The bombers flew their first sortie on day 16. I was not warned. I was not consulted. I was not informed. I was in the field hospital visiting Palith Dinar, a 60-year-old structural engineer who had lost both legs when the Dominion hit the transit hub. When the sound came, a rolling, bone-deep thunder that started at the edge of hearing and built until the walls of the hospital vibrated and the IV bags swung on their hooks, and every Valith patient in the ward went absolutely still, with the particular practiced stillness of people who have learned that when the sky makes that sound, you do not move. Selene was in the children's area 2 buildings away. I ran. I made it halfway there before a human sergeant physically caught me, a hand on my arm, firm and immovable, and said, "Ma'am, it's ours. Our birds. Scheduled strike on the Dominion munition depot at Kale's Reach. 60 clicks south. You're safe." I ripped my arm free. "My daughter. The children's area has been reinforced to withstand orbital bombardment. Your daughter is fine." "You didn't tell me. Nobody told me." The sergeant's face did something I would see 100 times on human faces over the coming months, a flicker of recognition, not of his error but of a gap he hadn't known existed. "The operation was classified until execution, ma'am. Commander's protocol. My people have been under bombardment for 2 months. Every adult in this settlement has trauma responses to exactly that sound. You just flew military aircraft over a population of 82,000 refugees with active combat trauma, and you didn't warn anyone." He processed this. I watched it happen. He was not stupid and he was not callous. I could see both things clearly, which made it worse because it meant the failure wasn't cruelty. It was architecture. Their systems didn't have a place for what I was telling him. "I'll pass that up the chain, ma'am," he said. Commander Aldrich found me an hour later in the command post. The strike had been successful. The Dominion munition depot at Kale's Reach was gone, removing a significant threat to the settlement. He told me this with the air of someone presenting a gift. 19 of my people had cardiac episodes, I said. Stress responses, flashbacks. 3 of them had to be sedated. A mother in Block 7 threw herself on top of her children and broke her own collarbone because she thought the bombardment had resumed. Aldrich sat down. He was quiet for a long time. Longer than I'd seen him be quiet about anything. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes. The operational security concern was real. If the Dominion intercepted, I understand the concern. I understand the reasoning. I need you to understand that your reasoning nearly killed Palith Dinar, who survived losing both legs to the Dominion and almost died of a heart attack because of the people who came to save her." He looked at his hands. They were large, scarred, and completely still. "It won't happen again," he said. And it didn't. Not exactly, but other things happened, things with the same shape, the same root cause. The humans would solve a problem I hadn't asked them to solve, in a way I hadn't approved, at a speed that made consultation impossible. And the solution would work, and the cost would be something they hadn't measured, because their systems didn't recognize it as a cost. They bulldozed the sacred grove at the south end of the settlement to install a geothermal power tap. The grove had been a place of mourning for 3 centuries, where we brought our dead, where we sang the dissolution chants, where the root structures had been shaped over generations into a living memorial architecture. It was, by any engineering assessment, a stand of old-growth vegetation on top of a prime energy resource. The power tap heated 9,000 homes through the first month of winter. The grove was gone, and when I confronted Aldrich, he showed me the thermal projections. Without the geothermal tap, 400 people would have died of exposure in the first cold snap. He showed me the numbers calmly, clearly, with the absolute conviction of a man who believed he had done the right thing, because the math was on his side. You could have put it somewhere else, I said. Not with the same output, not in time. The geology here was... You could have asked. Would you have said yes? I was quiet. If I had come to you and said, Administrator Torath, I can save 400 lives if you let me remove a sacred site, what would you have said? I would have asked for time to find another option. How much time? I don't know. Days. A week. The cold snap hit in 3 days. He said it without triumph. I didn't have a week, ma'am, and neither did you. This was the pattern. This was the thing I couldn't break or bend or find my way around. The humans were right. They were constantly, operationally, mathematically right. And being right, they moved forward with the momentum of people who believed rightness was sufficient justification. They never asked what else might be true at the same time. I started keeping a list, not officially, just a personal file on a salvaged data pad, updated each night after Salin fell asleep. I titled it Costs, and each entry was one line a thing the humans had solved and the thing they had broken solving it. Water purification restored. Aquifer shrine submerged under intake infrastructure. Eastern Ridge rebuilt. 300 years of residential continuity erased. Dominion munition depot destroyed. 19 cardiac episodes, 1 broken collarbone, 6 children who stopped speaking for days. Geothermal power operational. Sacred Grove removed. Dissolution chants have no location. Southern Road cleared for supply access. Valith Memorial Cairns relocated without ceremony. The list grew. And the thing that made it unbearable was that every entry on the left side, every solution, every system, every act of salvation was genuine. People were alive because of the humans. Thousands of people. My daughter was warm, fed, hydrated, and sleeping safely for the first time in months because James Aldrich and his people had crossed an unfathomable distance to help strangers they'd never met. And some of those people were going to die doing it. I knew this because I'd started paying attention to the humans themselves. Private Asha Kendrick was 22 years old and ran the water purification station 14 hours a day. She had burns on her forearms from a coolant leak during the first week that she'd treated herself because the medics were busy with our wounded. She called Selin Little Bug and carried nutrient bars in her cargo pockets, specifically to hand to Valith children who wandered near her station. Sergeant Thomas Reyes led the engineering team that had demolished the eastern quarter and rebuilt it. He was quiet, meticulous, and had a habit of touching structures he'd built, running his hands along the joins, the way a parent checks a sleeping child's temperature. I learned later that he had volunteered for the expeditionary group 3 days after his own home had been destroyed in a seismic event on a human colony. He had rebuilt our homes while his was rubble. Dr. Lin Xiaofan ran the field hospital with a precision that my own medical staff described as terrifying and perfect. She slept 4 hours a night, spent 2 hours every morning learning Valith physiological responses from our healers, and had, according to Tanel, cried exactly once, silently, in a supply closet, after losing a Valith child to organ failure she'd never seen before and couldn't reverse. These were not conquerors. They were not indifferent. They were people operating inside a system that processed the universe through a particular grammar, a grammar of force, efficiency, speed, and material solution. And that grammar had no vocabulary for what it was costing us to be saved in this way. I began to understand that the humans had not come to colonize or dominate. They had come to help. But their help was the product of a species that had learned, through what I would later understand was a history of unimaginable self-inflicted catastrophe, that the universe was hostile, that time was always short, that hesitation killed, and that the only reliable unit of compassion was a concrete outcome delivered before the deadline. They loved us the way they loved each other, by building, by fixing, by defending, by refusing to stop moving, and they had no idea that the motion itself was a kind of violence. The breaking came in the 7th week, and it came from me. Commander Aldrich had proposed. He was learning a restructuring of the civilian governance framework. He presented it in the command post, with maps, with logistics projections, with the calm, systematic thoroughness that meant he'd been building this plan for weeks. The restructuring made sense. Our existing provincial framework was designed for peacetime administration of distributed agricultural communities. It was not equipped for a concentrated refugee population dependent on external supply chains and military protection. Aldrich's proposal reorganized the settlement into functional sectors with human Veilith joint oversight, streamlined resource distribution, and integrated our civilian leadership into what he called the operational framework. It was, in every practical sense, a colonial governance structure. He didn't see it that way. I'm certain of that. He saw it as efficiency, as partnership, as the obvious solution to a coordination problem that was getting people killed because the gaps between his operations and my administration were real, and people had fallen through them. A food distribution failure in Block 12 the previous week had left 200 people without rations for 36 hours, because my distribution coordinator and his logistics officer were using different mapping systems, and neither knew the other existed. This integrates everything, Aldrich said, pointing to the organizational chart. Your people, my people, one system, no more gaps. One system with your people at every decision point, I said. Joint oversight. Your logistics, your communications, your infrastructure, your security. Joint oversight means my administrators sit in your meetings and approve decisions you've already made. That's not... Who controls the food supply, Commander? He hesitated. 1 second. That was all I needed. Who controls the water system, the power grid, the medical stores? Who decides when and where the bombers fly? Who decides what gets demolished and what gets built? Who decides how my people are organized, where they live, how they move through what used to be their own city? We're trying to keep them alive. You're keeping us alive, and you are deciding what alive means. You are deciding what shape our survival takes. You have decided that surviving means living inside your architecture, eating from your supply chain, sleeping in your buildings, walking on your roads, and obeying your organizational logic. And I am so grateful, Commander. I am grateful every single day. My daughter is alive because of you, but I did not send that signal so that my people could survive as a footnote in your operational framework. Aldrich stood very still. The room was silent, his officers, my administrators, and all of them watching. What do you want? He asked. Not defensively, genuinely. And this was where it broke, because I opened my mouth to answer, and I realized I didn't know. I couldn't run the water system without his engineers. I couldn't maintain the power grid without his technicians. I couldn't defend the settlement without his soldiers. I couldn't feed 82,000 people without his supply chain. Everything that kept us alive ran through human infrastructure, human expertise, human logistics. And I had no alternative because the Dominion had destroyed every Veilith system that could have served as one. I was demanding autonomy I could not exercise. I was asking for freedom inside a cage where every bar was a feeding tube. I want you to stop deciding for us, I said, and my voice cracked, and I hated that it cracked, and I saw Aldrich see it, and I saw something in his face that was worse than argument. I saw concern, the kind a competent person feels for someone they believe is making an emotional error. I want to be consulted before decisions are made. I want my people to have real authority, not decorative input. I want the sacred grove replanted, even if it reduces geothermal output. I want the memorial cairns returned to their original locations. I stopped, because what I wanted was to go back to the morning before the Dominion came and be an administrator of an intact province on an intact world, where the worst crisis I faced was a water rights dispute between agricultural districts. And I could not have that, and the humans could not give me that. And standing in a prefab command post surrounded by the people who had saved my daughter's life, I felt a grief so total that it had no target, not the Dominion, not the humans, not myself, just the irreversible fact that something had been taken and no amount of salvation could return it. I left the meeting. I went to my quarters. I held Selin, who was drawing on a data pad the human medics had given her, and I cried in a way I had not permitted myself since the bombardment. Selin looked at me and said, "Mama, why are you broken?" "I'm not broken, love. You're leaking." I almost laughed. Yes, I'm leaking. It's what Veilith do when too many things are true at the same time. She considered this. The loud man fixed the water when it leaked. Some leaks can't be fixed by loud men. Then who fixes them? I didn't have an answer. I held her tighter and let the leak continue. 3 days after the meeting, Tennell brought me the files. He'd found them by accident, or by the particular Valith instinct for information that had made him an excellent infrastructure coordinator and now made him an inadvertent spy. He'd been in the human logistics network troubleshooting the mapping discrepancy that had caused the Block 12 ration failure, and he'd accessed a subdirectory that wasn't locked because he suspected nobody had imagined a Valith administrator would know how to navigate a human file system. "You need to see this," he said. The files were casualty reports. 13 human soldiers had died since the operation began. 13. I had known about 3 killed in the Kale's Reach strike, and 1 in a structural collapse during the Eastern Quarter demolition. The other 10 were classified. Perimeter engagements, Tennell said. Dominion probes testing the settlement's defenses. Small actions, brief, brutal. Handled by the human military so quickly and so quietly that the Valith population had never known they occurred. The humans were fighting a low-grade war around our settlement every night, and Commander Aldrich had not told me. I read the names, the dates, the brief clinical summaries. Private Kowalski, killed by fragmentation during a Dominion drone intercept. Corporal Hassan, died of wounds sustained in a perimeter skirmish. Specialist Yun, killed when her position was overrun during a sensor disruption. Each entry was followed by a logistics notation reclassifying the deceased's equipment and reassigning their duties. They were dying for us and filing the paperwork before the bodies were cold. I found Aldrich alone for once, standing outside the command post in the early dark. The temperature had dropped. Winter was settling in. His breath made clouds, and he was staring at the sky with the expression of someone who was not looking at stars but looking for something that wasn't there. 13, I said. He didn't turn. 13 of your people are dead and you didn't tell me. It wasn't relevant to civilian operations. Wasn't relevant. You had 82,000 people to manage through the onset of winter. You were already carrying more than any single person should carry. The perimeter situation was a military matter and I handled it as a military matter. You hid it from me. Now he turned. Yes. Why? And there it was. The thing I'd sensed since the first day. The shape beneath the efficiency and the protocol and the operational grammar. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, James Aldrich did not look like a commander. He looked like a man standing in the dark on a planet that wasn't his, very far from home, carrying a weight that his system also had no vocabulary for. "Because you would grieve," he said, "and I need you functional." The words hit me like a fist. Not because they were cruel, they weren't, but because they were true, and the truth they contained was the entire problem compressed into 9 words. He had hidden the deaths of his own people from me because my grief was, in his calculus, an operational liability. Because he cared about the mission more than my right to know. Because in his grammar, protecting me from pain was the same as protecting me from a collapsing building, a structural intervention performed by someone who knew better. "You don't get to decide what I carry," I said. "I know that. You just told me you did exactly that." "I did, and I would do it again." He paused. "And I know that makes me the thing you're afraid I am." "What thing?" "The thing that decides for you. The thing that takes your choices because it believes its judgment is better than yours." He looked back at the sky. "I've been thinking about what you said, in the meeting, about the sacred grove, the cairns, the governance structure. You were right, about all of it." I waited. "I knew you were right when you said it. I've known it for weeks. But I couldn't. I didn't know how to slow down. My people are dying. Your people are dying. The Dominion is still out there, and winter is here, and every hour I spend consulting is an hour someone might die in. So I built, I fixed, I moved. Because that's what I know how to do. Because when I stop moving, I hear the names." He recited them then. All 13. Without looking at anything. Without pausing. The way you recite something you've said to yourself so many times it's become the rhythm of your breathing. "I didn't hide them from you because I thought you were weak," he said. "I hid them because you're the only person on this planet who would have felt them the way I do. And I wasn't ready to share that with anyone." I stood beside him in the cold, on the broken world I'd administered and he'd fortified, and for the first time since the humans arrived, The distance between us was not a gap between species or systems or grammars. It was just two people who were very tired and very scared and very far from anything that felt like enough. "Tell me their names again," I said. He did, and I memorized them. And that night, I added a new column to my list, not costs, but carried, and I wrote 13 names in it. The change didn't come all at once. It came the way the humans built things in stages, with too much material and not enough elegance, and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was finished. Aldrich presented a revised governance proposal a week later. This one had been developed jointly, with Tennell and my senior administrators embedded in the planning process from the first hour. It wasn't perfect. The humans still controlled the critical infrastructure because we still couldn't run it without them. But the decision-making authority was real, not decorative, and the consultation protocols had teeth. No action affecting Valeth cultural sites, residential areas, or communal spaces without my explicit authorization and a 48-hour review period. 48 hours is an eternity in an emergency, Aldrich said when we negotiated it. "Then you'll have to plan better," I said. He almost smiled. It was the first time I'd seen his face do that. The sacred grove could not be restored. The geothermal tap was embedded in the root substrate, and removing it would cut power to 9,000 homes in the middle of winter. But Dr. Lin, who had apparently been paying attention to everything, proposed a hybrid solution. A grove replanted around the infrastructure, using Valeth horticultural techniques combined with a human rapid growth substrate that would establish root structures in months rather than decades. It would not be the old grove. It would not have 3 centuries of shaped roots and accumulated memory. But it would be a place where the dissolution chants could be sung, and over time the roots would grow, and the grove would become itself. The memorial cairns were returned, each one placed by Valeth hands, with Sergeant Reyes's engineering team providing structural support. Reyes stood at a respectful distance during the placement ceremonies, watching with an expression I couldn't read. Afterward, he found me. "I didn't know what they were," he said, "when we moved them. I knew they were stone structures, and I knew they were in the way of the road, and I didn't know what they meant." "Would it have mattered if you did?" He was quiet for a long time. "I want to say yes. I want to say I would have built the road differently. But honestly, ma'am, I don't know. I was moving so fast. We were all moving so fast. And when you're moving that fast, everything that isn't the immediate problem looks like an obstacle. You're not moving as fast now. No, ma'am, you slowed us down." He said it without resentment. "It's harder, but the road I would have built, the fast one, the efficient one. It would have been a human road on a Valeth world. The one we're building now takes longer, but it goes where your people actually need to go." I kept adding to my list, but the entries were changing. Perimeter defense expanded, Valeth scouts integrated. 2 Valeth soldiers request permanent cross-training. Medical protocol revised. Valeth healing practices documented alongside human procedures. Dr. Lin learning dissolution chants for terminal patients. Block 12 distribution failure resolved. Joint mapping system created. Valeth administrator has override authority. Bombers fly second sortie. Settlement warned 24 hours in advance. Community shelter protocols activated. 0 cardiac episodes. Children watch from observation points. The children. I need to talk about the children. Valeth children and human children, there were some. Dependents of military personnel who'd had no alternative childcare options and brought their families along began to mix within the first month. Language was a barrier for about 6 days, which was apparently how long it took for a 4-year-old Valeth and a 5-year-old human to develop a functional pidgin language composed of gesture, sound effects, and a shared taxonomy of interesting rocks. Selen was at the center of this. My quiet, cautious daughter who had not spoken for 3 days after the bombardment and who flinched at loud noises became, in the company of human children, someone I almost didn't recognize. She was louder, bolder. She ran. She had not truly run at full speed for the joy of it since before the Dominion came. I watched her sprint across the rebuilt eastern quarter with a human child named Marcus, both of them screaming about something to do with an imaginary creature they'd invented together, and I thought, this. Whatever else the humans have broken, whatever else they've taken, whatever else they've decided for us without asking, they gave me this. My daughter running. And I could not weigh that against the grove. I could not balance it against the cairns or the demolished quarter or the 13 dead soldiers or the governance structure that still bore the fingerprints of a colonial architecture. I could not make the calculus work because the calculus was wrong, not the math, but the assumption that a single ledger could hold both the cost and the gift. They came on the 93rd day. Not a probe, not a drone, a fleet. 14 warships in standard Dominion assault formation, dropping out of transit above Althura with the cold precision that had ended worlds across the sector. I was in the new Joint Operations Center when the alert came. The human communications officer's voice was calm. They were all calm, always in crisis, which I had learned was not the absence of fear but a discipline so deep it had become autonomic. 14 contacts, Dominion configuration, assault posture, time to engagement range, 41 minutes. Aldrich was already moving, issuing orders. The human military machine, the thing I had struggled against for 3 months, the thing I had called colonial and overbearing and deaf to everything that wasn't an operational problem, activated around me like a living system, every component knowing its role, every person moving to a designated position, with a speed that transcended training and entered the territory of instinct. The bombers launched, the perimeter defenses charged, the carrier group's point defense systems came online with a sound like the planet clearing its throat. And I realized, standing in the operations center with Selene in the underground shelter below me and 82,000 Valith civilians behind a wall of human steel and human bodies, that this was why the bombers had come. This was why the carrier group had come. This was why the command post looked like a military installation, and the hospital could be a triage center, and the residential blocks on the eastern ridge were oriented for overlapping fields of fire. Not because the humans couldn't tell the difference between rescue and war. Because they knew they had always known, with the bone-deep certainty of a species that had crawled out of its own ashes more times than it could count. That rescue without the ability to defend it was just a more elaborate way to die. Aldrich was on comms with the carrier group's captain, a woman named Torres, whose voice I'd never heard before, and who spoke with the flat, measured cadence of someone who had been waiting for this since day one. Carrier group engaging. Bomber wing deployed to intercept Vanguard. Ground defense to full alert. I watched the tactical display. The human ships moved to meet the Dominion fleet, and they were outnumbered, and they were outgunned. The Dominion fielded capital ships that dwarfed the human carrier, and they attacked anyway, without hesitation, without drama. They flew into the teeth of a superior force, because between that force and my people stood the width of their hulls and the depth of their refusal. The engagement lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. 5 human ships were destroyed. 106 humans died. The Dominion lost 9 warships and retreated. I listened to the communications traffic as it happened. The voices of human officers reporting damage, requesting support, acknowledging hits that killed their crews. One voice, a pilot, young female, her ship hit and burning, said, "Reactor breach in 40 seconds. Final pass on target 3. Tell Kendrick I drank her coffee." The line went dead. I found out later that her name was Lieutenant Yara Osei. She was 26. She had been in the expeditionary group for 2 months. She had a photograph of a dog taped to her instrument panel, and she had flown her burning ship into a Dominion cruiser's engine array because the cruiser was on a trajectory that would have brought it within bombardment range of the settlement. She had never spoken to a Valith. She died for us anyway. Aldrich found me after the engagement in the operations center, sitting in front of the tactical display that now showed the debris field where 5 human ships and 9 Dominion ships had torn each other apart. He was covered in dust. A ceiling panel in the command post had been knocked loose by a near miss, and he had a cut above his left eye that he hadn't noticed. "Casualty report is still coming in," he said. "We held." 106, I said. "Yes. 106 names." He looked at me, and I saw it, the thing he carried, the thing the motion was designed to outrun, the thing he heard when he stopped. Not guilt, not regret, just the accumulating weight of people who had trusted him to spend their lives wisely, and the knowledge that wisdom was not the same as painlessness. "I'll need to add a column to my list," I said. "What list?" "The one I keep. Costs and gifts. I need a new column. I don't have a word for it yet." "What would it contain?" The things that were given that I didn't ask for and can't repay and don't know how to hold. He sat down beside me. The cut above his eye was bleeding slowly. I reached over and pressed a cloth to it, and he let me. And for a moment we were not a provincial administrator and a military commander. Not Vaylith and human. Not the rescued and the rescuer. We were two people in a room full of names trying to carry them together. The Dominion did not return. Intelligence, human intelligence, gathered by human assets and human networks that extended far beyond our system, indicated that the battle at Althura had cost them enough to reclassify the operation as non-viable. A species they had bombed and abandoned had been claimed by a species they did not understand, and the claiming had been backed with fire, and the fire had been real. We were safe. Not because we were strong, but because someone else had chosen to be strong on our behalf, and the cost of that strength was still being counted. In the months that followed, things changed. Not the way a page turns clean and complete, but the way a river changes its bed slowly, persistently, through friction. Vaylith engineers began working alongside Reyes's teams, not as laborers but as designers. Our architecture was different, curved, where theirs was angular, organic, where theirs was modular, shaped by aesthetic principles the humans initially couldn't parse. But Reyes, who ran his hands along the joints of things he'd built, understood instinctively that beauty was structural, that a building people loved was a building people maintained, and that maintenance was the difference between a structure that lasted and one that was abandoned. The new buildings in the Eastern Quarter began to look like neither Vaylith nor human architecture. They looked like something else, something that had no name yet. Dr. Lin published a joint medical protocol that integrated Vaylith healing practices which the human medics had initially dismissed as cultural ritual with human clinical methodology. The paper demonstrated that Vaylith empathic bonding techniques measurably accelerated tissue regeneration in Vaylith patients, something the human equipment had been measuring but misattributing to pharmacological intervention. Lin's abstract read, in part, "We were so busy looking at our instruments that we missed the medicine happening between the people." Private Kendrick's water purification station became a community center. Not by design, no one decided it would be, but because Kendrick kept giving food to children and the children kept coming back and their parents followed and someone set up benches and someone else started a meal-sharing arrangement, and within 2 months there was a daily gathering at the water station that was part engineering briefing, part communal meal, and part something the Vaylith had a word for Telenerith that translates roughly as the warmth of being accountable to each other. The humans didn't have a word for it. They just showed up every day. The governance structure continued to evolve, not toward autonomy. True autonomy was still years away, dependent on rebuilding the infrastructure the Dominion had destroyed, but toward something more honest than autonomy. Partnership is the wrong word. Partnership implies equality. And we were not equal. We were broken and they were not. And pretending otherwise would have been a different kind of condescension. What we built was more like what Selen and Marcus had built, a pigeon. A shared language assembled from gesture and necessity, and the willingness to look foolish while learning. We kept some of their grammar, and they learned some of ours, and the arguments never stopped, and the arguments were good, because they meant both sides still cared enough to fight for the shape of what we were becoming. I still keep the list. It lives on the same salvaged data pad, though the pad itself now sits in the new civic terrace rebuilt on its original foundation, with Vaylith curves and human structural reinforcement, and a memorial wall made of stone from the original cairns and steel from the hull of Lieutenant Osei's ship. The list has 3 columns now. Costs, carried, given. The costs column is long. The sacred grove in its original form is gone. The Eastern Quarter's 3 centuries of continuity exist only in photographs. The murals were recorded, but a recording is not a wall. 19 cardiac episodes, 1 broken collarbone, a governance structure that still has human engineering at its foundation, because we have not yet rebuilt the capacity to replace it. The sound of bombers over a refugee settlement. The particular intimate violation of being managed by someone who loves you. The carried column is longer. 119 names. 13 from the perimeter engagements. 106 from the battle. Each one a person who came to a planet they'd never seen to protect people they'd never met. Private Kendrick's burns, Sergeant Reyes's lost home, Dr. Lin's silent weeping in a supply closet, Commander Aldrich standing in the dark reciting names to the sky, Lieutenant Osei's dog. The coffee she drank that wasn't hers. The given column is the one I can't measure. Salin running. The hybrid grove, 3 months old, already taking root. Talon Areth at the water station. Reyes's hand on a curved wall he didn't design but helped build. Lynn singing a dissolution chant in imperfect Valeth beside a dying patient who smiled. A child's pidgin language. A species that crossed the dark to answer a signal from a stranger and brought everything it had. Commanders, builders, bombers, grief, kindness, clumsiness, conviction, and an absolute inability to sit still while someone suffered. They sent too much. They always send too much. That is the human flaw and the human gift, and they are the same thing, and I have stopped trying to separate them. I look at my list most nights. 3 columns: costs, carried, given. And the thing I've learned, the thing that took 2 years and 119 names in a sacred grove and a daughter running, is that the columns don't balance. They were never going to balance. The idea that they should, that rescue should arrive clean and precise and without excess, that help should cost only what the helped are willing to pay, that idea belongs to a universe that has never been on fire. This is what shelter looks like where they come from. It is loud. It is clumsy. It breaks things you love in the process of saving things you need. It arrives with bombers because it knows the fire might follow. It moves too fast because it has buried too many people who move too slowly. It decides for you because it is terrified of the pause in which you might die. And it carries the weight of every decision, every grove, every cairn, every name, not because it is good at grief, but because it refuses to do the efficient thing and forget. Selene is 6 now. She speaks fluent human pidgin, intermediate English, and has informed me that when she grows up she wants to be a builder-healer, a profession that does not exist and that she is therefore going to invent. She draws the new grove every week and mails the drawings to Marcus, who has gone home to a planet she has never seen, via the human communication relay. Her latest drawing shows the grove at full maturity decades from now, long past what either of us will likely see. The roots are thick and tangled and wrapped around the geothermal infrastructure, holding it and growing through it and transforming it into something that is neither machine nor memorial, but both. She titled it Talon Areth. I asked her what it meant, even though I know the word, because I wanted to hear her definition. It's the warm thing, she said. When the loud ones and the quiet ones take care of each other, and it's hard, but they don't stop. I added it to the list. 4th column, no heading yet. Just her word, and the drawing, and the fact that my daughter can name a thing that her mother spent 2 years trying to separate into costs and gifts, and she holds it whole, and it doesn't break her because she never learned that it was supposed to come apart. The humans sent commanders, builders, and bombers. What they meant to send was themselves. I am still learning the difference between what help looks like and what help is. I expect I will be learning it for the rest of my life, in this city that is neither Valeth nor human, nor anything that existed before a provincial administrator with no options pressed a button and asked strangers for shelter. They came, they broke things, they saved us, they stayed, and the grove is growing.